We begin in the bustling city of Utah, where Steve Graham is preparing for the funeral of his wife's mother, Ellen Taper Lee, along with his teenage son, Peter. After realizing that his daughter is not in her room, Steve checks the treehouse, where he finds his 13-year-old daughter, Charlie, who was asleep. He wakes her immediately as they are about to be late. Meanwhile, Steve's wife, Annie, waits in the car, rehearsing her eulogy for her mother. At the funeral, as Annie nervously delivers her speech, Charlie makes a noise with her tongue while drawing a bizarre sketch of her mother. Later, Annie, who is an artist sculpting a miniature diorama, continues working in her studio to prepare for an upcoming exhibit. Steve visits her and then goes to Peter's room to check on him before wishing him good night. At the same time, Annie comforts Charlie, who is genuinely upset about Ellen's death, unlike the others. To comfort her, Annie reminds Charlie that she was the grandmother's favorite, but Charlie insists that her grandmother always wanted her to be a boy. Charlie also worries about who will take care of her if her mother dies, so Annie reassures her that Steve or Peter will take care of her if that happens. Before leaving, Annie notices the word Satani written on the wall of Charlie's room. Later that night, Annie looks through a memory album in her studio and sees her mother smiling at her in the dark. Startled, Annie hides her miniature diorama, which depicts Ellen trying to breastfeed Charlie. At school, Charlie is making a toy instead of taking a test when a bird flies into the classroom window. As her classmates make a fuss about it, Charlie stares at a pair of scissors as if she is planning something. Later, Charlie goes outside and checks the bird. She then cuts off its head and puts it in her pocket before casually eating her favorite chocolate. After that, she sees a woman across the street waving at her. At the same time, Annie is working in her studio when she notices that her mother's room is open and sees a large triangle drawn on the floor. Horrified, Annie closes it and asks Steve if he went into Ellen's room, to which Steve replies that he did not, and then locks it so it won't disturb her anymore. Suddenly, he receives a call from a cemetery informing him that Ellen's grave has been desecrated. He decides to keep the news a secret from Annie, who suspects nothing is wrong. Annie then tells her husband that she is going to the movies, but in reality, she goes to a support group for people in grief. That night, Annie hesitates to share her loss, but soon speaks openly about her mother's mental health issues, including dissociative identity disorder and dementia. She also talks about her father, who had psychotic depression and died from starvation, and her schizophrenic brother, who tragically ended his life. Annie shares how her mother was manipulative and how she felt guilty when Ellen got sick. Finally, Annie expresses that she feels blamed, but doesn't know why. The next morning, Charlie is creating a mannequin in her room when she notices a strange light leading outside. She follows the light to the back of the house, walking as if she is in a trance while holding the bird's head. Meanwhile, the gallery owner contacts Annie to ask about the status of her new creations, so she goes to her room to take pictures of them. Suddenly, Peter comes in and asks permission to take the car to a school party, hoping to see Bridget, a classmate he likes. Annie then asks him if his sister is going with him, and Peter immediately goes to find Charlie. Back in the backyard, Charlie sees her grandmother surrounded by flames. Stupefied, Charlie clicks her tongue as if calling for Ellen. Suddenly, Annie, furious, arrives and drags Charlie back home because it's cold outside. When Charlie tells her mother that she wants her grandmother back, Annie forces her to go with Peter to the party, hoping Charlie will find some friends. On the way to the party, Peter seems irritated with Charlie as she keeps clicking her tongue. They pass a telephone pole that has a strange symbol on it. At the party, Peter quickly notices Bridget sitting alone on the couch. He wants to spend time with her and invites her to join him, leaving Charlie alone in the crowd. Charlie then eats a piece of chocolate cake, unaware that it contains nuts, to which she is allergic. Soon, Charlie has trouble breathing due to an anaphylactic reaction and alerts her brother about it. Worried, Peter takes his sister to the car and drives down the dark road toward the hospital. Charlie is writhing in the back seat as she struggles to breathe, so Peter speeds up, not realizing that Charlie has pushed her head out the window to get some air. Suddenly, Peter swerves uncontrollably to avoid a dead deer on the road, causing Charlie's head to hit a pole. Peter comes to a sudden stop in shock, and while he sits there staring at the road for a while, he tries to comprehend what happened. He even tries to look in the rearview mirror but stops because he cannot face reality. Instead, Peter drives home in a state of silent stupor. At home, he gets out of the car and never looks back before going straight to his room. Traumatized, Peter lies in bed until morning, and eventually hears his mother screaming upon finding Charlie's headless body in the car. In the following days, Annie continues to cry in pain while Peter sinks into his own guilt and conscience. Soon, the family holds Charlie's funeral. The next day, Peter has a panic attack while smoking herbs under the bleachers at school. When his friends try to calm him down, Peter cries and says he feels like his throat is growing. That night, Peter arrives home and takes a deep breath before entering. Unbeknownst to him, Annie is sitting in her car in the garage, grieving. She then goes to the support group location, where she changes her mind and decides to leave. However, before returning home, a member of the support group, Joan, stops her and encourages her to go. After hearing about Charlie's death, Joan sympathizes and shares that she recently lost her own son and grandson. Joan then gives Annie her number in case she needs someone to talk to. When Annie gets home and goes to bed, Steve tries to get close to her, but she rejects him. Annie then decides to sleep in Charlie's treehouse. At the same time, Peter hears the sound of Charlie's tongue and gets scared when he looks at his sweatshirt in the corner of the room, initially thinking it is his dead sister. The next day, Annie visits Joan at her apartment. After telling what happened to Charlie, Annie recounts her episode of sleepwalking, in which she bathed Peter, Charlie, and herself with paint thinner before waking up just about to light a match. She claims to have been surprised and confused when she woke up holding a box of matches in her left hand and a can of paint thinner in her right. Annie admits to Joan that her relationship with her children has never been the same since that day. During dinner, Annie seems odd as she barely touches her food. She occasionally glances at Peter, who struggles to cut his steak, making him uncomfortable. Peter then asks if there is something she wants to say. However, Annie initially refuses to speak, but begins to open up until she ends up yelling at him, blaming her son for Charlie's death. She tells him that dinner would be nice if Peter apologized and took responsibility for the accident, but she is frustrated because nobody admits anything. Peter then looks at her and reminds her that it was she who forced Charlie to go to the party in the first place, so Steve intervenes and tells them to stop, causing Annie to leave. The next day, Annie does her best to keep working on her diorama for the exhibit. At an art supply store, Annie runs into Joan, who happily tells her about an open seance she attended. Joan informs her that they learned how to conduct a seance and says that a spirit medium could invoke her deceased grandson. She then encourages Annie to go with her and observe a seance up close. At her apartment, Joan immediately starts the ritual and contacts her grandson, who communicates with them using a glass and a chalkboard. Scared, Annie begins to have a panic attack as she witnesses the chalk moving on its own. Joan assures Annie that she can also perform a similar invocation using a personal item from the deceased person as a link, reciting a mysterious spell and ensuring that all her family is present during the ritual. Joan then hands Annie a candle and a spell guide before leaving. On her way home, Annie hears a clicking sound while driving to her surprise. When Annie wakes up that night, she discovers a swarm of ants heading to Peter's room, where his face is covered in ants. Suddenly, Peter wakes her and says she is sleepwalking, also wondering why she seems afraid of him. Annie then involuntarily admits that she never intended to be his mother and even tried to have a miscarriage. As Peter cries during the confrontation, both become inflamed. Suddenly, Annie wakes up and realizes she just had a nightmare within a nightmare. While Steve and Peter sleep, Annie recites Joan's spell with Charlie's sketchbook. Annie then enthusiastically wakes her husband and son for a new seance, claiming she contacted Charlie. While Steve refuses to participate, Peter joins in when he sees how much Annie truly wants this. Steve then agrees, and Annie finally calls out for Charlie. A little later, Peter feels the air grow cold and the glass moves in front of him. When Annie calls for Charlie again and she does not respond, Annie becomes desperate and seems to go insane. Meanwhile, Peter cries as he feels scared. When Annie tries to explain what is happening, a glass falls behind her and the candle shines brighter. Suddenly, it appears that Charlie possesses Annie. Peter then screams in horror, and Steve interrupts Annie's trance by throwing water on her before comforting his terrified son. During class, Peter notices the same strange light that Charlie saw in her room. He then becomes scared when he sees his reflection smiling at him, causing him to leave the room. At the same time, Steve calls Annie, informing her that Peter contacted him from school and believes a malevolent spirit is following him. He also tells her to stop acting strangely, since he still has a son to protect before hanging up. Annie then receives another call from the art gallery. Feeling pressured, Annie accidentally breaks the miniature chair, destroying everything in her studio. One night, Annie sees Charlie's pen drawing strangely in her old sketchbook. Meanwhile, Peter sees his dead sister in his room, and her head falls off before transforming into a ball on the floor. However, he is convinced that something strange is happening as the house dog enters and barks in his room. Suddenly, someone grabs his head from behind, and Peter can only struggle on the bed while screaming in fear. When Annie enters, Peter accuses her of sleepwalking and trying to kill him again. But Annie denies doing anything and advises Peter not to tell Steve about what happened, saying that something strange is going on in the house and that she is the only one who can stop it. It turns out that the strange sketches Annie saw earlier are about Peter, as if they were depicting his death. Annie then throws Charlie's sketchbook in the fireplace after realizing that the spirit she invoked is malevolent. Unfortunately, as the book burns, Annie's arm catches fire as well, reflecting the burning book. With no choice, Annie saves the book from the flames. The next day, Annie goes back to Joan for help, but Joan is not around. Unbeknownst to Annie, Joan's apartment is filled with witchcraft-related things, including a photo of Peter inside a ceremonial triangle with Charlie's crafts beside it. Then, Annie notices a familiar symbol on Joan's rug and rushes home to inspect her mother's things. Meanwhile, Joan shouts, "I exorcise you," at Peter from behind a fence at school. Confused, Peter looks around and wonders if he is the one being called. Back at home, Annie discovers a book that instructs how the demon Paimon could possess the most vulnerable host and that the symbol she saw is associated with him. She also finds images of Joan with Ellen, showing that both were members of a coven devoted to gaining wealth by invoking Paimon and placing him into a male body. Feeling overwhelmed, Annie decides to hide Ellen's things in the attic, but instead finds Ellen's headless body with a symbol of Paimon nearby. At the same time, Peter hears the sound of Charlie's tongue during class. Suddenly, Peter raises his hand as if he is having a seizure and, without warning, bangs his head on the desk. After the second hit, Peter comes to and screams in panic and pain. Just like him, his classmates are confused and terrified by what has happened. On the other hand, Steve thinks about sending Annie to a rehab center. He then receives an email about the desecration of Ellen's grave before getting a call from Peter's school, informing him about what happened to his son. Steve then takes Peter home and nearly gets into a car accident, making him cry about what is happening to his family lately. While Peter sleeps, Annie tells Steve that Ellen's body is in the attic, but that it has been decapitated. Steve then checks the attic and quickly realizes that his wife is telling the truth, while wondering why she didn't call the police. Annie insists that the police cannot help them, and the more she talks about her mother and about Joan and the group that worships Paimon, the more Steve believes she has lost her mind. Annie also shows Steve images of Joan and Ellen using Paimon's seal and tells him that their family was cursed when she tried to contact Charlie. As Annie speaks hysterically, Steve looks at her with pity. Finally, when Annie reveals the importance of Charlie's sketchbook and how Steve must burn it to save their son, Steve tells her that she needs to go to the rehab center. Steve then refuses to burn the sketchbook, causing Annie to throw it in the fire, despite believing it would burn her. Instead, Steve catches fire while Annie watches in horror. Suddenly, she seems to be possessed, again. Shortly after, Peter wakes up, unaware that his demonic mother is floating behind him. He also doesn't notice when she silently crawls up the wall out of his room, and when he looks for Steve, Peter finds his father's burnt body. As Peter cries, he hears noises behind him and sees an unknown naked man smiling at him. The possessed Annie then chases Peter up to the attic, and although he manages to lock himself in there, Annie continues to terrorize him by banging her head against the door. In the attic, Peter finds flies, candles, and a photo of himself on the floor. However, Ellen's body has disappeared. He then slaps himself in the face, hoping to wake up from a nightmare, but hears a strange noise. When he looks up, he sees Annie levitating while trying to decapitate herself with a string. Upon seeing his mother, Peter notices 3 more strange naked people smiling at him. Horrified, Peter jumps out the window and falls into the yard, where he passes out. Then, a strange bright light enters Peter's body and helps him regain consciousness. Peter then follows the headless body of his mother as it floats into the treehouse, and as he walks, the naked strange people watch him. In the treehouse, Peter is welcomed by a group of Paimon worshippers. He also sees Charlie's decapitated head resting on the statue of Paimon. Confused, Peter looks around and sees the headless bodies of Annie and Ellen kneeling on the floor in front of the statue. A little later, Joan calls Peter Charlie and tells him they corrected his female form before crowning him as Paimon, one of the 8 kings of hell. While Joan honors Paimon, the followers kneel before him and worship their new ruler.